Well, welcome, everyone. Thanks, see you there. Hi, I'm Tom Zimnick, and I'm the Vice President for Advancement here at PHC. And we are honored and delighted to begin another week of Newsmakers interview series with Dr. Marvin Lasky. We've been privileged to host this series since 2011. As you know, Dr. Lasky is the editor-in-chief of World Magazine, and he is also the professor of journalism here at Patrick Henry College, where he holds the Distinguished Chair in Journalism and Public Policy. So today we have a very special guest, and I have some literature to help me with it here, Ms. Heather Rice-Minus, and she is with Justice Fellowship, which is the advocacy arm of Prison Fellowship Ministries. And she actually just had a title change. She is now Director of Government Affairs, is that correct, at Justice Fellowship. And she is the staff lead for legislative strategy, working with the faith community, think tanks, and other stakeholders to advance criminal justice reforms, including policies addressing victims' rights and services, sentencing for drug offenses, prison conditions, and reentry programming. In addition to all that, she is commissioned as a Centurion, which is an incredible Christian worldview program by the Colson Center, and she holds a JD from the George Mason University School of Law. And she resides here in southeastern Washington, D.C. with her husband, Paul, and we are very pleased to have her here. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Marvin Lasky and Heather Rice-Minus.
Well, Heather, thank you for coming.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Big question here. How does someone get a job like yours?
That's a good question. I think one of the best things you can do is, if this is an interest for you, criminal justice issues, is to intern, actually. I remember I started interning when I was in college for another policy shop on Capitol Hill, and the connections I made there sort of led me to various jobs along the lines, and then I ended up working on criminal justice issues, got to know some of the staff through some of the events I was working on for my old organization, and landed up at Justice Fellowship. And I was just telling Marvin, we actually have someone on staff who's a Patrick Henry grad, and we have some Patrick Henry students intern with us every summer. So I think that's a great opportunity just to get to know some of the staff, show your skills, and that sort of thing. And
I see that you also interned at one of the really interesting names for an organization, the Rocky Mountain Survivor Center.
Yes.
What was that, and what was that like?
When I was in Colorado for undergrad, I was a social work major, double major, and I did my field placement with the Rocky Mountain Survivor Center. And it served survivors of torture from across the world who were seeking asylum and in the Denver area. And so we would work with folks, providing them kind of holistic services, legal assistance with their cases, as well as group therapy, resume building, basic social services as well. And so that's what I did for about a year in Denver.
And what did that teach you?
Oh, goodness. It taught me just the resilience of some people. I remember many of the clients we had faith in God and helped get them through the situations they had. And it also taught me the amazing blessing we have in this country to worship the way we want, to express our political views in a democracy. And we take that for granted all too often, I think.
Mm-hmm. And then you spent a year, rather than jumping directly from undergraduate at Colorado State to George Mason Law School, you spent a year in Djibouti.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, I spent a year in Djibouti, which is in East Africa, tiny little country, French-speaking, in the Horn of Africa, next to Ethiopia and Eritrea, Somalia. And I taught English there at the university. Had an amazing year. It was a very impactful year of my life. It's a 99% Muslim country. So I had the opportunity to, live out my faith. People, of course, expected as an American that I was a Christian. But it opened some doors just to talk openly with friendships I made through some of the faculty at the university about my faith, and to live in a country that was so vastly different than my own forces you to be very intentional with the relationships you create. And then I also had the opportunity to volunteer in a number of different orphanages, and I was sharing with you, I think that I was very interested in, and still remain interested in, adoption and foster care and those sort of things, and just seeing some of the conditions that we also take for granted in this country, even though there's plenty to be fixed with the foster care system. Living in Djibouti, you see institutionalized care and the lack of attention kids get in that sort of setting, very stark.
So you had these interesting experiences, and then following law school, you did not take what is a common path and go for the big bucks of a corporate law position.
Right.
You chose this, and why?
Well, I knew early on, even before I decided to go to law school, my intention was also always to work in policy. I had done a fellowship before I left for East Africa with the Congressional Coalition on Adoption Institute. Loved my work there. Loved working on a particular issue, and so that was my intention. Criminal justice, I think God kind of put me on a path towards that I wasn't expecting. But what's unique about working in policy and government affairs is that if you work for an organization like Justice Fellowship that's faith-based, on issues that you find interesting, you get to argue your values every day. And I find that much more rewarding than I think I would in a job where I was doing corporate or other kinds of law, where in some cases perhaps you're representing people that you don't feel comfortable doing so. And every day I get to argue my values to people on the Hill and affect kind of the big picture. Instead of case by case, we're arguing for broad, sweeping changes to reforms.
Okay, so let's drill down into values and policy changes. We have a system essentially in our law devoted to punishing the criminal, and in some ways, the government takes revenge on the criminal, as if the government is the offended party. You're pushing for something very different. Tell us the basis of restorative justice, and then we'll get into some particular cases and subsets of that.
Right. So restorative justice is really about promoting the dignity of human life. The same way, many believers promote or have a pro-life stance. We believe the same value, the dignity and value of human life, should also apply to the criminal justice system. And so that means trying to reflect that value with all people impacted by crime and incarceration. So the person responsible for the crime, victims, and the community should have those values reflected. And we have a restorative justice framework that goes through different values that attach to the responsible party, to the victim or harmed party, as well as the community. And like you said, I think sometimes in our system, the government sort of steps in the place of the person who's been harmed and doles out a punishment that isn't necessarily what actually would make the victim whole. And our process can sometimes be so much about efficiency that healing the person is not, the central priority. And so what we're arguing for are policy changes that would allow people who've been harmed by crime and victims to have greater participation in the process and to lay out what they think accountability should look like, and an expectation that the person who is responsible for the crime, would get proportionate punishment, but also would have an expectation to make amends to their victim and to earn back the public's trust.
So let me throw an extreme case at you, because I want to see how far this goes. One of the people I interviewed in Texas prisons who has a life sentence is there because 20 years ago he slashed the throats of two people also. At that time he was about 21 and they were about 21. How can you restore that? What does restorative justice mean in a situation like that?
Right. Well, one of our values is always for the community is public safety. So I don't want to dismiss that and say that there aren't people who we need incarceration as an option to protect that value as well in the community as a whole. But I think every case is unique, and what the family goes through in a very harsh case like that should be at the forefront of trying to come to some sort of begin to make things right. And I don't think we can expect necessarily that the harmed party is ever going to feel whole again after a situation like that. But oftentimes people who have been harmed by crime want the opportunity to ask questions. They want to know why something happened, why the person chose to do this. And they may have ideas about what would help begin to make things right. There's some really unique restorative justice programs that are starting to crop up. There's much more in terms of restorative justice practices across the world than there are in the United States. But there are some unique programs in the country that are happening. And even with some cases of violence and assault and that sort of thing. And it's interesting learning from these practitioners what they hear victims asking for. And sometimes what the victim wants in the course of the process of meeting with someone is for that person to change and transform. And so there may be specific things they want to help heal them, but part of their healing process may be seeing changes in that person's life, like them being a better father, for example, or asking for them to write an apology letter every year on the anniversary of the death of the person that they killed.
So is that something then in this particular very grievous case I mentioned, an apology letter? In other words, how would it look like? Obviously, his two primary victims are dead. There are secondary victims, certainly parents, friends, loved ones, and so forth.
Right.
Would you have him in this situation be writing a letter on the anniversary? What would you do? What would you actually specifically recommend in this situation?
Well, we would never specifically recommend anything for a particular case because we think it's the harmed party, the victim, who should make the recommendation, and it should be at their will and at their desire to be part of that process. We want to elevate the opportunity for the victim to have participation and to lay out specifically what would make them personally whole. And I think that's part of the difficulty is, we want a system that's efficient, right? And trying to get to a place where they even know what would help make them whole is a tedious process.
Well, then at the extreme as in this case, not this specific case, but in other cases involving murder, can you give an example of how it's worked in a situation like that, where there's a murderer who's now in prison? Let's say he's in prison for life. What has the offended party, let's say parents of his victims or husbands, wives, friends, and so what have they asked for?
There are some really amazing, few but far between, some very amazing cases, and some of the examples I've heard from those have been writing a letter on the anniversary of the death. Mentoring people from within prison has been a request. Trying to help people who maybe are younger within the prison system steer back on and not make those kind of drastic decisions later in their life. So those are a few of the examples I can think of.
Okay, so this is a very tough situation I've thrown at you.
Right.
Here's an easier one with which you have personal experience. Tell us about the guy who came into your home in Djibouti while you were sleeping, and what happened then, and what type of restorative justice you would want.
So I was living in Djibouti, and I had a man come into my house at night. I was sleeping, my roommate was out of town, and I heard some noises and walked into the room next door, my roommate's room, saw this man, and just started screaming and ran at him, which was my first reaction, not a very smart one, but luckily he ran away and went out the back door.
Because he had a knife, but he put that down.
He had put that down, yeah. He had it on the bed. I think he was just using it to get into things, not necessarily violent intent, but I had this feeling very... it affected me quite a bit, the situation, more than I really let on to anyone, because he had been in my room before I woke up, and I hadn't heard him. And he had pulled things out from under my bed. He had taken my cell phone, and I actually called it, and he actually picked up and said hello right after that. And
reach out and touch someone.
Yeah, and I told him in French, God could see him, and I asked him his name, and then he hung up. But we never caught the man, whoever this was. And, I had trouble sleeping after that. Even when I came back to the States, gradually it sort of wore off, but I had apprehension all the time when I was in my home. And I imagine, this person, and I remember thinking through it all the time while I was there, probably had a need far greater than mine for the things that he took from our apartment. But I don't think that negates... I don't think that ever is an excuse for someone to take something from someone. And it's much more than just the possessions. Crime harms people, and it tears a fabric in society. And if I had the opportunity to sit down with him, I still think about what I would have said, particularly now given the work that I do. And I think I would have wanted to know, what the situation was, why he did this, why he felt he had a right to come in and invade my space like that. And I would have wanted him to know... the effect it had on me, and that it's much more than just a transactional, someone's taking something who needs it more than another person. It's about the impact it has on our safety and our feeling of community.
So here's a situation where I can see it working because I know one person who, when he was 15, was doing some daytime robberies of houses, and for him it was a way of getting stuff, and he thought in terms of a transfer of material stuff, and I suspect he really hadn't thought about the psychological havoc that would create among the people in that house from whom he had stolen. Even though they weren't there, nevertheless they would feel the violation, and so it was a lot more than just property involved.
Right.
And I don't think that person probably ever really thought of it in those terms. So we've taken two extreme situations in a sense. I mean, one where there's desperate physical harm, murder,
right,
and the other in which there's some property. But I can see how it would work in that case. What's a middle of the road case? In other words, we're talking somewhat high on the ladder of abstraction. I want to see if I can bring you down to give us a situation where it really has worked in that way.
Right. Well, restorative justice practices have been really helpful for juveniles in particular. So where you have, for example, property or vandalism. So maybe someone spray painted someone's fence. You have cases where they find the youth who is involved, and what the person wants might be that the youth comes back and mows their lawn for the rest of the summer. And so they actually kind of restore the relationship. There's some responsibility had. The person is held accountable. They know the person that they've harmed. They get an opportunity to tell them, how that made them feel. And, the ongoing relationship that's rebuilt as a result works as a deterrent effect too. Now that young person knows the family that they've impacted, and now they're going back to mow their lawn every week and paying it back, if you will. And of course, we definitely believe that restitution and compensation should be given to victims, no matter, particularly for very egregious crimes where there is a lot of economic loss through hospital bills and funeral costs and all those sorts of things.
So right now we have a two-ply legal system. We have criminal law, where in essence the offense is against the state and the state takes punishment. And then we have civil law, where there's some reimbursement. Are you basically trying in many ways to merge the two and create the civil law aspect of criminal law?
I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I think first and foremost, some people don't have the resources or the knowledge of how to use the civil system. And so oftentimes a lot of people who are harmed by crime are actually from very poor communities,
right,
and don't have the feasibility to do that. And so what we're asking for is that the criminal law system would actually reflect more opportunities for participation of the harmed party and shaping what accountability would look like even in the criminal law system.
And do the harmed parties tend to want this, or are they? I mean, in your situation in Djibouti,
yeah,
you would have liked to have that. Because you actually had called him, and perhaps if he had, talked to, then you would have developed something over time, and that might have educated him. In other situations, do the harmed parties tend to want it, or they say, "I just want to forget about it"?
I think that's completely valid for someone to say, "I want to forget about it." We're not trying to dismiss that. We don't think we should force people who have been harmed by crime to participate in a restorative justice process, and that's, we would never do that. But it is interesting that where restorative practices are available to people, I know that there's a program out of Brooklyn right now that's been running for a couple of years, and it involves people who have committed very serious crimes, assaults, sometimes murders, and you have secondary victims who are involved, and prosecutors in Brooklyn have to refer the cases, so they have to decide this is a case that they want to make the option for this restorative practice to be available instead of the traditional criminal justice process. So they'll refer it, and then it's up to the victim whether or not they want to use the traditional criminal justice process or this restorative process. And the restorative process that they go through is an 18-month mediation, if you will, where they lay out an individualized restitution plan and craft what they want accountability to look like. And if the person who's responsible completes this plan that they put out, and they don't have any other major problems along the way, then they will get out with a misdemeanor on their record. If they don't complete it, they will get a mandatory period of incarceration that's laid out by the prosecutor. So in any case, the cases that have been referred by prosecutors, 95% of the victims in these cases opt for the restorative justice program versus the traditional criminal justice process. So I think that goes to show you how much people would like to have a voice and participation when given the opportunity to do so.
But it's victim's choice, in essence.
Exactly.
Okay. So the state does not have a position on it. They make this an option available. The accused doesn't have, or the convicted person doesn't have an option on it. It's the victim who can make the choice of which to do.
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
And I want to say too, I don't think that restorative justice necessarily supplants the value of public safety. I think that I think we should do our best to make the harmed party whole, but that also has to be balanced with is incarceration or other measures necessary to also protect the public.
Okay. So talking about public safety then, one of the things you're pushing for is to ban the box, and maybe you can talk about that a little bit, and then also expunging records. Talk about those two things.
Sure. So I'll plug Justice Fellowship has a report that came out last year called Punishment Without End, and that discusses this phenomenon called risk convergence. Basically, depending on the age of someone and the offense that they've committed, over time, their level of risk of recommitting a crime is going to converge with that of the general public. So at some point in time, they will reach a point where they are no more likely to commit a new crime than Joe Schmo, who has never committed a crime.
Right.
And this happens over a period of time depending on the age and the offense. And so we often apply punishments or barriers to people with criminal history for the rest of their lives. We ask people on job applications often to, say that they've had a conviction, a felony, or even a misdemeanor. Sometimes certain applications ask even for, might be college or otherwise if you've even had an arrest. And we know from data that, in fact, this person doesn't pose any greater risk after a certain point because of the phenomenon of risk convergence.
Well, let me just say, we know from data on the average.
On the average, that's correct. Yep. And of course, everyone, you, me, we all hold some risk of committing a crime at any time, right? You can never guarantee that no one will. But yet we continue to sort of apply these never-ending punishments to people, or never-ending barriers, if you will. And so we would advocate that people who have committed crimes, so after we've held them accountable, given them proportionate punishment, that there should be the value of closure represented in our system. And where there isn't a nexus to public safety, we should allow people to reintegrate back into the community and back into society and become contributing members at their highest potential in our communities as possible. And so that's why we try and promote, one example of a policy reform that we promote is ban the box, or fair chance hiring practices.
Tell us what the box is.
So that's oftentimes employers will ask very upfront, even on an application, whether or not you have criminal history. And ban the box is about removing that from the initial process, because oftentimes people will just be moved and not even considered after they see that, and have employers wait later in the process after they've had a chance to interview someone, get to know them, and that person has a chance to talk with them about evidence of rehabilitation and explain the situation in person. At that point, to talk about criminal history record, but to take it off the initial employment application. And about 15 states across the country have now implemented, and over 100 cities across the country too have now implemented this practice of banning the box.
Okay, and then expunging records.
In expunging records, similarly, we think that we should try and match the expungement of records with risk convergence. And so, if we know after this period of time this person's risk has gone back down to that of the general public on average, removing people's criminal history records so that they have a better chance at reintegration after that point, and after they've proved themselves and earned back the public's trust over that period of time, and by not recidivating. Okay,
but isn't that depriving an employer, a potential employer, and perhaps an actual employer of valuable information?
I guess our point would be at the point of risk convergence, how valuable is that information anymore? We think it's very valuable because of our associated fear with people who have criminal history, but if on average this person is no more likely to commit a crime any other applicant who's never committed a crime anymore, why do we continue to allow that information to be such a telling factor? And I'm not trying to say that someone shouldn't talk about their history or criminal history, but in the process of interviewing with someone, but to make that upfront is something that can automatically kind of exclude people, as we know it does happen in hiring practices, is a problem, and it actually reduces our GDP. Economists believe that our GDP is actually reduced by not having people employed who have criminal history records, anywhere from $57 billion per year.
Okay, but now that you recently have a new title, which implies a promotion, and at a certain point, when there's a promoted person, that person is in want of an assistant. Wouldn't you like to know as much as you can about the background of the person you would hire as an assistant?
Like I said, I don't think it's we want to preclude people from sharing their criminal history. And at Justice Fellowship, actually, we joke that I'm one of the few people that doesn't have a record. Obviously, we were founded by Chuck Colson, and
who had a record.
Yeah, exactly. And our executive director was a former Speaker of the House in Michigan, but was the youngest Speaker of the House in the country, and fell as a result of some alcohol-related arrests. And my colleague, Jesse, who graduated law school the same year I did, robbed a bank at 21 and got involved in prison fellowship and went to law school after that. So, we certainly, we prefer that people share their story with us, but in my line of work, it tends to be an advantage to sort of have been through the system yourself. But what we're saying is we want people to have the opportunity to build rapport with the employer, and at that point to be able to share, what their experience has been.
So I guess as a journalist, my tendency is to think in terms of more information rather than less information. One of the other proposals that you've made is for the issuance of certificates of rehabilitation, which is giving more information rather than depriving a potential employer of information. I mean, why not emphasize that aspect of it so that, yes, a potential employer would learn about the criminal background of a particular individual, but that individual could also present a certificate of rehabilitation saying, here's evidence that, at least in the eyes of the government, I've changed, not just my own testimony, but the government's testimony. So why not provide more information rather than removing information?
I think at this point, certificates of rehabilitation, that's something that's being promulgated in certain states across the country as an opportunity for reform. So after someone's been re-entered the community after a period of time, they pay all of their court costs and all of those sorts of things, participate in different programs, they can get a certificate. But unfortunately, because of the stigma that goes along with having criminal history, it hasn't been shown to be particularly more effective at helping people secure employment and having other opportunities open to them. Because I think we carry such fear and such stigma with criminal history that even though people are upfront and honest about their stories or have to be as a result of the processes we have right now for employment, sometimes that doesn't help.
Now, if potential employers think this is significant, they want to know about whether potential hires have a criminal past. If it's not something that a person divulges in that way, won't that just lead to more searches? Because after all, even if a person's record is expunged, there are lots of private organizations that have information, everything's available, there's no requirement they expunge it. So wouldn't it just really drive up costs for potential employers rather than actually help the individuals involved? I mean, won't they be looking for this information if they can't get it in just the easy ways people can get it now? Won't it just lead people to spend more money to get it in harder ways, because the information will still be available for people who really want it? So how will that really help?
Yeah, well, I'm not necessarily sure that that's the case. I can remember my, in terms of, I think employers right now go through a significant process to find background information. And I can remember my colleague Jesse telling me when he got hired at Prison Fellowship, they knew he obviously had a criminal background. He'd been through Prison Fellowship's programming and so forth. And when they were hiring him, they said, we looked for your record, but we can't find it. Can you send it to us? And they had done this background check and weren't able to actually find it. So he had to go find a record for him and send it their way.
In order to be eligible to be hired, you have to have a record pretty much.
That's apparently, it seems to be.
They made an exception for you.
Yeah, they made an exception for me. But I think employers already tend to go through that process already, and if someone is encouraged to divulge that information during the interview process, that's what we would advocate, is that people would be honest throughout the process about their criminal history, and but we know that rapport building during the employment hiring process is very important to eventually securing employment. So if people are ruling people out off the bat because of their record, or because they've asked for that information on the first application, they're much less likely to get the opportunity to show the efforts that they've made to rehabilitate.
Okay. Let me ask about another policy recommendation that you've made concerning ways to fight prison rape and so forth, a very grievous situation. Tell us about that.
Sure. So before I actually came to Justice Fellowship, we had Pat Nolan, who was our former president. Justice Fellowship spent a lot of time and succeeded in passing the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And unfortunately, I think, it's kind of gotten to the point where people sort of expected people to have sexual assault happen in prison. And I think that somewhat still within our culture that, that's something that just happens to you and maybe should happen to you, according to popular culture when you go to prison. But, obviously, if we believe in the dignity and value of all people, no matter what you've done, that is not part of your prison sentence. And the Prison Rape Elimination Act helped set up standards for protocols in prison, helped help with oversight of jails and prisons across the country to make sure this doesn't happen, and also helps with setting up structures for reporting, so that the person you report to, if it was a correctional officer who assaulted you, you don't have to report to that correctional officer, which could sometimes be the case, or has specific measures that are taken to protect you if it was another person in prison who assaulted you. It has process for that now.
So what are some of the specific measures that can be taken within the prison environment?
So making sure that there is a designated person who can take complaints, who's outside of the correctional staff, so that there's a sort of third party who's unbiased, who can take confidential information about sexual assault is very important. Having oversight so that prisons and jails actually have to report on sexual assaults every year came out of the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And making sure we screen people who go into prison. So it's definitely tightened the security process, I would say, for volunteers and other people who are coming into our prisons and jails.
Would you ever sequester a person who's been threatened with prison rape? In other words, in essence, solitary confinement as a protective device?
Unfortunately, that does sometimes happen, and I think it's unfortunate. I think there's something to be said for having small groups of people who are maybe more vulnerable within prison to be housed together, and having units like that available. But I would say it's sort of a second punishment or re-victimization of someone to put them into solitary confinement. So we would not advocate that someone should be placed alone unless they've asked and volunteered for that.
So individual cells, perhaps, but not solitary confinement? I mean, a row of cells, is that a better situation?
Sure. I think, people should be able to have interaction if that's what they want with other people, but trying to, if there are, oftentimes with protective custody, there's a number of people who need protective custody. So to be able to house them together safely, I think is a better situation where they can have, interaction, but still have their own individual cells, but during the day, have other activities with other people within the prison.
Okay. A couple of other questions, and then we'll open it up for questions from any of you. About probation. Is there a way now with, is there a high-tech solution to some of the problems as far as, should we be having more electronic monitoring so that you can keep track of a person better as opposed to house arrest or probation or other types of things that may require a person staying in a particular place?
Sure. So, I mean, I think electronic monitoring is a great advancement that we've made in the criminal justice system, and allows us to, in a much more cost-effective way, monitor people. There's also community options where people will check in, or even young people in the juvenile system will have day centers where they come report in during the day once a day, so people can be held accountable in that sort of fashion. But I would say, I think there is a lot of work to be done in our probation system, which is really this opportunity we have to get people back on the right track before they make a more serious mistake, that we need better accounting of sort of recidivism rates. So, we often have better research available to us on recidivism rates after people are released from jail or prison, but we're not necessarily as tedious about tracking probation offices' records in terms of how many of the people that they're seeing are recidivizing and ending up in prison, and trying to align incentives with the programs that are doing well at that, probation programs.
And are all these programs and devices in a way trying to make some changes, but so many of the changes actually require an individual change, not so much an external control change, but a change inside?
Right.
How effective can any of these things be without that internal change?
Well, I really don't think they can be, or you're lucky, you're just sheer luck if that transformation doesn't happen. And, we crafted this restorative justice framework, which I encourage people to go to justicefellowship.org, click on restorative justice. You can see all of the different values. And I crafted these with my colleague, Jesse. And we always talk about, you can't force someone to earn back the public's trust. Yeah. You can't force, a victim to participate in a restorative justice practice. All the government can do, and all we believe the government should do, is make the opportunity available. But they need to do a good job of making those opportunities available, and that's the sort of policy reforms that we get at, are trying to make sure that those opportunities, do happen for all the parties impacted by crime, including the community.
So, put another way, in the absence of Christ, what's the likelihood of any of these things really having much of an effect?
Well, if you look at recidivism rates in our country, it is pretty bleak if you think about that. And that's why I think I'm so blessed to work for an advocacy organization that also has a program arm. Prison Fellowship has decades of experience helping people transform, really getting at the heart of why they've landed in prison, and helping them rebuild their lives, and walk with Christ, and walk a different path. And so we have countless volunteers across the country who go into the prisons and mentor people, and that is so important.
Yeah. Questions for any of y'all? One over here.
Thanks so much for coming to speak to us today. Kind of more of a personal ministry-related note. What kind of personality does it take to minister in any capacity to these people through Prison Fellowship Ministries, or any other kind of ministry that deals with prison and inmates specifically?
Yeah. I think it takes, first and foremost, someone who's willing. We need so many more volunteers across the country. And for my own personal story, I've been doing this work on policy and advocacy, and have never had someone in my personal family impacted. And over a year ago, my nephew on my husband's side of the family went to prison, and we actually didn't get along before he went to prison. And I just felt this tugging from the Lord. Here I am, I work for Prison Fellowship, I'm talking about criminal justice reforms every day, and I have this nephew in prison. So I started just writing him letters, and slowly but surely, the Lord really used that process to mend our relationship. And I think a lot of the quality that is needed is someone willing to listen. Just like in every day when you're trying to share your faith with someone, we can't beat the Bible, down someone's throat. We have to be available and show our genuineness. And, I talked to my colleague Jesse, who, committed armed robbery at 21, and he got involved in Prison Fellowship's program. And he said, what really struck him was his mentor, Dan Kingery, who still works for us for Prison Fellowship, amazing guy. He would just watch him pray, and he would just get down on his knees and pray, and pray with such fervor. And he would just talk about his life very openly. And he would talk about him, not necessarily preach at Jesse about how he needed to change, but just talk about his own internal struggles. And I think that genuine and that transparency about the struggles that Dan was having in his own life with Jesse made all the difference. And so I think just to have to remember, even though someone's in prison, I think be willing, but also be willing to be humble and be willing to be able to share about what else you're struggling with in your life. Because if people can find common ground with you, it's going to be much more likely that you're going to kind of be able to build that kind of relationship to have the opportunity to speak into their lives at some point down the road.
And does the common ground go? This kind of seems strange, but is there any kind of, could there be any kind of a tension between one who's ministering and has never been incarcerated or in any kind of trouble, and with whom the prisoner can't find that common ground with? Is it more? Is it better that someone ministers who has been incarcerated, perhaps, or has been who has infringed on the law somehow and has come out of that? Is that a better witness, or can it work either way?
I think it can work either way, but I think there is incredible value to having people who have been out of the system and walked that path to then give back and mentor people who have been there and done that. But I really do think it can go both ways. And now my nephew was released, and he's lived with us on and off since he got out, and he's struggled with the reentry process. And in fact, I kind of had to have a sit down with him, and I just told him, I'm so nervous to talk to you. I've been praying all day, and I'm worried I'm going to say the wrong thing and offend you. And he said, Auntie, there's nothing you could say that would upset me. You wrote me more than anyone else while I was in prison. And even if you yelled at me and told me I could never come back to your house, what you did for me, you can never take back. And you wouldn't believe, when you're in prison, life stands still. You have so much more time than all of us do. And the little things people do for you. He said, I really saw, he was involved in, had a lot of friends of bad influence. And they didn't return his calls, they didn't send him money while he was in prison. And it was the people who he didn't realize while he was out that really loved him. And that, showed through in just taking the time to visit him or call or write him letters. All those small things really do count. And so, I would say if you feel kind of that tinge in your heart that maybe that's what God's calling you to do, I'd love to talk to you. And prisonfellowship.org has a place to sign up for advocacy opportunities. And even something smaller if you're not quite ready to go into a prison setting yet or have the opportunity to do so is we have a program called Angel Tree. And we service amazing, but also unfortunately, over 300,000 children of incarcerated parents every year at Christmas time. And we provide gifts for them on behalf of their incarcerated parents. And so would encourage you to sign up for that. I know it's something I like to do at Christmas and sort of gives you the opportunity to remember the least of these.
I've read that in New Zealand there's a lot of interest in restorative justice,
Yeah.
but when it comes to situations involving sexual predators, that's where people are tending to draw the line. How do you deal with that here in the U.S.?
I think that is a tough situation, particularly because of oftentimes the power dynamic that's at play with sexual assault and sexual violence. And just to be clear, Justice Fellowship, we're not practitioners. We don't run restorative justice practices. And what we're trying to do is get at the same values of making all parties who are impacted by crime and incarceration whole and bringing them along the path to restoration. But I would say that there is something still to be said for giving those who have been harmed by sexual violence the opportunity to participate and with proper preparation and training, the opportunity to say what accountability should look like for the person who has harmed them.
Yeah, you talked about the restorative justice program running concurrently with the incarceration program, and that victims in certain situations have choice to choose one over the other. Do the victims actually decide what the accountability is in that situation, and how are the victims prepared for that? Is there any accountability that somebody steps in and says, no, that's too far, you can't require that? How does that play out? Because I'm sure they've gone through such a traumatic experience, forming a helpful understanding of what the accountability looks like has got to be shaped somehow.
Right. Well, there are a number. I know I was actually just at a meeting of restorative justice practitioners this last week in Richmond, because there are a number of restorative justice programs that are available in the Virginia area, and there's talk of trying to potentially make an office of restorative justice within Virginia. And so there is training that folks go through who participate and run these restorative justice programs, and so they're the folks who really help kind of coach someone who is a victim through the process, and talk to them about what their options are and what that can look like. For us at Justice Fellowship, in terms of making policy recommendations, we would say, first and foremost, the victim should have the right to participate, to craft what would actually make them whole, but that can't go, of course, beyond the bounds of what our Constitution would allow for punishment. And also there should be a component of when you harm someone in an individualized situation, of course, you've harmed that direct party, but you've also harmed the community. And so there's a responsibility that person has to the community as a whole, too, when they commit a property crime or a violent crime or what have you. And so that's why I would say, even if a victim decides to extend mercy, in a sense, that still needs to be weighed with public safety, because that person has not only harmed the victim, but they've also, tarred the community.
I have a question. Thank you so much for coming out. It's been really interesting to listen to this. A couple years ago, I was over in Thailand on a missions trip with some missionaries who did a lot of prison work. And one of the things they did was just, they visited a couple different prisons, and they would just pull names on a roster and send us in to talk to people for 20 or 30 minutes. And it was quite a learning curve for me to get over that. But one of the things I was always stuck with was, what do you say to people when you only have 30 minutes to visit? Because they said, the prisoners love it when we visit them because they never get called otherwise. But I never really knew what to say. So what would you tell someone in that position, to talk with a prisoner about?
Oh, goodness. That's a good question. I mean, that's tough. I guess it depends on the person. I just like talking to anyone else. What someone wants to talk about is different depending on the individual. So I think I would just recommend, asking how they're doing. And one thing I would ask, and it depends on the situation too. I mean, if it's someone who's going to be there for a long time, I remember for me, writing back with my nephew, who I felt like we didn't have very much common ground when I started this process. What was I going to say to him? So some of it, especially because we were writing, not just talking, I would talk about my own life and what was going on, and then that would kind of give him the opportunity to feel comfortable to talk about what was going on in his life. And then I think you can kind of play off of that. So, I knew he, was working on his basketball game while he was in, so I'd, check on that. I would, if it's someone who's near release and that, then I think that can be helpful just to talk through, what are your hopes and aspirations. I love to hear from people who are near release about, what are you really looking forward to? And, it's interesting because that helps you sort of think through the things we take for granted. Being able to take a shower without shoes on, for example, is one small thing. And then I think, people, whether you're in prison or not, they have family members, and just being able to talk through, who they miss, and what their days were like before prison, and what motivates them while they're in prison. And if it's someone who is a believer, being able to ask them about their faith and how God has moved them, just like you would want to know from someone who's on the outside. And I think you hear such incredible testimonies from people who are inside of what God's done. But I agree with you. 30 minutes is not long enough, and that's brave of you to have been willing to go do that. And I trust you got some good stories from that too.
Would you recommend talking about Christ in that situation? Does that help in that limited period of time, or does it seem like a hit and run?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I hate to be cliche, but I would let the Spirit move you, you know. I think my preference is to be able to, in prison fellowship, you know, when we do volunteer training, you know, we hopefully have someone who's going to be there for a long period of time. But I think, of course, you know, if you know you're only going to have 30 minutes and the door is open for you to be able to share your personal testimony, absolutely. And for them to know that part of your motivation from coming to see them was because, you know, Christ told us to visit the prisoner in the Bible. You never know what kind of impact even a small visit like that may, you know, plant a seed somewhere.
Yeah, we definitely did include that. We explained we were with a missionary group, and so we did witness a lot. Would there be anything in particular that you would say don't talk about with prisoners?
Well, one thing I would actually recommend not talking about is asking someone what their offense was. I think that's something especially for me when I work in the advocacy field, like if we're going to set someone up, that's what reporters always want to know first, and I understand that, but particularly if you're just visiting someone, I think you know, letting them be the person who tells you that. That I guess that's my one recommendation that comes to my head off the top of my head.
Hi, thank you again for coming. It's really helpful to have you here today. I was curious if Prison Fellowship has an official stance or philosophy when it came to the death penalty. And either way, what kind of your perspective is on that issue and how it relates to kind of the things that you've been talking about in terms of retribution and reconciliation and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So Prison Fellowship does not take an official position on the death penalty, and we have, if you go to our website at justicefellowship.org, you can click on issues, and then there's a death penalty capital punishment page, and it sort of lays out the different arguments that can be made on either side of the issue. For me personally, it's something I definitely struggle with, and I've actually gone back. Chuck Colson, you know, our founder, was opposed to the death penalty when he worked on these issues until he met someone who actually changed his mind in prison, and he writes in one of his books, you know, and I'd be happy to look it up and find it for you if you're interested in his perspective, where he actually decides that he believes that there should be the death penalty. For me personally, I tend to lean, when I think through it, I really struggle with having the death penalty available, and we were even just talking about that too, how, you know, I think that even in the Bible, when it talks about an eye for an eye, you know, that is the max of what's available, but it's not compulsory. And I think through some of the verses in the Bible about, you know, it's mine to avenge, says the Lord, and ultimately God is going to make things just in end times. And so, you know, I think that there is more to be had for, you know, respecting life in such a way that, you know, you can still punish someone and give them life without parole. And in some ways, could be argued a greater punishment than the death penalty in some cases. And that also gives the person the maximum opportunity to have a change in heart and potentially, you know, come to know the Lord. So that's where I personally stand on it, I guess.
Yeah, that's the conclusion that I pretty much came to after doing a lot of interviews several years ago with convicted murderers in Texas prisons. But I think, okay, since today is Patriots' Day in Massachusetts, which means it's the second anniversary of the marathon bombing.
Yeah.
If you were on the jury in that situation, I mean, he's declared guilty, then you're in the death penalty question phase. How do you think you would vote on the jury?
Oh, goodness. You're giving me the tough
putting you on the
today.
spot.
Yeah. You know, I think first and foremost, I would try and get off that jury at the beginning, making very clear my personal conviction about that. And I'm sure that they probably did vet quite a few people at that phase. But I think it's something I would really struggle with, to be honest. You know, but I do think that, you know, it is, on the other hand, whether it's life without parole or the death penalty, I think that there's something to be said for being able to give the secondary victim sort of that closure of knowing that this is like, you know, you're not going to have to keep having this come up through the rest of your life as someone is heard for parole too.
Yeah. Questions?
Hi, thanks again for coming. I know you mentioned that there were some programs near Boston that had a 95% preference for using the restorative justice over the typical practices. I was just wondering what the recidivation rate comparison was between people who have gone through the restorative justice and haven't.
Right. Well, this is a very small program. It's actually out of Brooklyn. And it hasn't had enough people to really produce a comprehensive report, and I think they're waiting for more time. But so far, of the people that they have had participate, they say that they have really excellent recidivism rates compared to the general criminal justice process. I think eventually when they collect enough data are going to try and go public with that. And they're not only tracking, which I find interesting, recidivism rates, they're calculating things like victims' well-being and mental health and doing sort of qualitative analysis afterwards. And so they're hopefully going to make all of that public. And there's a lot more available because there are so many more robust programs abroad than in the United States about restorative justice practices and success rates in terms of recidivism.
I visited the Jester 2 prison, which was really the initial prison fellowship program in Texas, and there's now about 16 years of evidence indicating, from what I've seen, that it does really going through this program that involves religious mentoring, a Christian program, does substantially reduce the recidivism rate there.
And when you think about it, I mean, I was sharing that with my nephew. He had been involved in property crime, and I was asking him, early when he was about to, do you ever think you'd do it again? And he kind of had these arguments about, he was living in Detroit, really struggling. He had 2 little girls, and he just sort of saw it as very transactional, which I imagine a lot of people do. I'm just trying to get by and that sort of thing. And so I just, I felt I was at a point in our relationship where I could say to him, these are real people that you're harming. And I found what he responded back so interesting, because he kind of paused and he said, you're right. When I first did this, the very first couple of times, I really felt badly. But the crime he was involved in, there's no faces. You never see the person's face, and particularly with property crime, oftentimes the criminal justice process, I just wonder, did he even have to meet any of the people? Maybe not. And so it becomes, our criminal justice process can become such that you really don't even see the human element of the terror that you've created. And so that's why I think recidivism rates, really can be dramatically changed when people realize the real life harm that they're causing.
Well, last question then, drug crimes. What's the applicability of restorative justice to that whole plate full of tangled wires?
Right. And drug crime is quite the topic of the day. I know I do all of our federal lobbying for Justice Fellowship, and 50% of our federal prison system is made up of people who have committed drug crimes. And we have a very overcrowded system, and our penalties are very harsh for people who, arguably don't have any direct victims. Although, certainly the case can be made that the entire community is a victim as a result of drug crime. So, I think you really have to tailor it. If you're going to look at drug crime, you're going to have to pull together quite a network of the community to talk about harm that's happened, bring neighbors together who don't feel safe as a result of that, bring people together who have had, in some cases, parents who have lost children as a result of overdoses and drug users, and you're going to have a much more robust collective of the community come together to help have that person see the harm that they've caused because of the nature of the crime.
Does Prison Fellowship have a position on marijuana legalization, and do you?
We do not have a position on that. I think, overall, we don't support the legalization of marijuana, although, I think there's something to be said about decriminalization as opposed to legalization. And certainly that debate is alive and well. I know our executive director, Craig DeRoche, is very active in the addiction and recovery community. He had his bout with the criminal justice system because of some alcohol-related arrests. And, I think we could do a much better job of making sure we're getting people the help that they need. And I would also say there is some really an amazing program called HOPE out of Hawaii that uses sort of swift and certain sanctions, particularly for people who have drug offenses, where they actually, instead of, perhaps you're using drugs again and your probation or parole officer waits for the 10th time, all right, that's it, I caught you again, and now I'm going to send you back to prison for a really long period of time. This program, instead of having that, they actually test people really regularly, and then they send you into short bouts of jail time. So, if you test positive, they're going to send you to jail for the weekend so that you don't lose your job. And if you do it again, you're going to get even more time. So these very swift and certain sanctions, and that actually helps people get clean, just having that sort of regular consequence in addition to, treatment options.
Okay. Well, let me stress for any of you here and anyone watching this that if you're looking for a job, it is not a requirement for a job at Prison Fellowship that you have a criminal background. Is that-
No.
So, anyway, please join me in thanking Heather Rice-Minus.
Thank you so much.